Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
hmm
Today, we'll be kind of digging into some pretty interesting stuff at the intersection of geopolitics and economics. And we've got some really fascinating sources for this one. We've got an interview with a senior colonel talking about China's possible role in a post-Russia-Ukraine war world. Also, some insights from a joint press conference by President Trump and President Macron. And to round things out, we've got some expert analysis of the U.S. housing market and consumer behavior. It's going to be a wild ride, so buckle up.
Yeah, it's amazing how these topics, at first glance, they seem totally separate.
Yeah,
But when you start digging a little deeper, the connections are really pretty striking.
right. Like, who would have thought we'd be talking about ceasefires and critical minerals and tariffs all in the same breath? But hey, that's what we're here for, right? To connect those dots.
hmm
But first, let's dive into this senior colonel's take.
hmm
He's making a pretty bold claim, saying that China could actually become like a guarantor of European security after a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire.
Yeah, that's a huge statement. And you have to understand that China taking a direct role in European security, well, that would be totally unprecedented. The colonel points to a few things that make this a real possibility. First, Ukraine is really looking for some strong guarantees this time around. They want to avoid a repeat of what happened before the invasion when those security pledges didn't really do much to protect them.
Yeah, this time they want more than just promises on paper.
Exactly. They need to see some serious action. And then you've got Russia, who obviously wants to avoid being completely isolated on the world stage. Their relationship with the West is, well, it's pretty strained to say the least. So China's potential involvement starts to look even more interesting.
So China steps in, offering a helping hand to both Ukraine and Russia. But what is it about China that makes them such an appealing partner for this kind of thing? Especially when it comes to something as complex as securing a post-war Europe?
The colonel points to a few key things. China's seen as relatively impartial. They've got this massive and well-equipped peacekeeping force, and they have a ton of expertise in infrastructure development, which would be crucial for rebuilding after the war. It's like they're not just there to keep the peace, but to actually help rebuild and reshape the whole security landscape.
That raises the question, though. Would China's role be mainly focused on peacekeeping, or would they use their economic influence as well?
That's a great question. And the colonel doesn't really shy away from it. While he thinks China could be a major player in a post-ceasefire world, he's not so sure about their ability to directly influence a ceasefire itself. He sees them more as shaping the environment after the fighting stops, rather than actually ending the conflict.
So less of a direct negotiator and more of like an architect of the new order.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this potential shift in China's global involvement, that's something we really need to keep an eye on. It has implications not just for Europe, but for the whole global balance of power.
For sure. Now, speaking power players, let's shift gears and talk about President Trump and President Macron. Their joint press conference was quite the show, with both of them calling for an end to the horrible, bloody mess in Ukraine.
It's interesting how President Trump really frames himself as the peacemaker here. He's emphasizing all the progress that's supposedly been made in talks with Russia and how important it is to get a ceasefire in place as that first step towards lasting peace.
He even brought up those talks between U.S. and Russian delegations in Saudi Arabia. Makes you think there might be a lot more going on behind the scenes than we realize.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's another layer to this. President Trump is really hammering home this idea that Europe needs to step up and take on more of the financial burden for Ukraine's security. He's even suggesting that the U.S. might try to recoup some of the aid costs.
He's not shying away from the money talk, that's for sure. It seems like there's more to this than just a peace deal. But then he goes on to hint at this U.S.-Ukraine agreement on critical minerals as part of a broader security arrangement. And on top of that, there's talk of a meeting between Trump and Zelensky.
This is where things get really interesting because now we're seeing the economic and geopolitical dimensions start to blend together. We're talking about critical minerals, which are absolutely essential for all sorts of industries like technology and defense. This agreement could signal a major shift in the global supply chain, with the U.S. maybe trying to reduce its reliance on other sources like China, for example.
Which brings us right back to what the senior colonel was saying about China's economic strength and their, potential impatience when it comes to Taiwan. It feels like we're watching this complex interplay of economic interests and geopolitical ambitions all playing out on a global scale.
Exactly. And to really understand what this all means, we need to look at what's happening in the U.S. housing market and with consumer behavior.
From geopolitics to mortgages, it's all connected, right?
Hmm.
Let's dive into those economic trends and see what they tell us about the bigger picture.
Sounds good. Our economic experts have been noticing a slowdown in U.S. housing construction, mainly because of those high mortgage rates and uncertainty about future costs.
Yeah, those high mortgage rates can really throw a wrench in things for people who are thinking about buying a home.
Definitely. But there's an interesting twist here. Builders are rushing to finish up those projects they've already started, so that could lead to more homes being available in the short term, which might sound good for buyers, but it also means there's going to be more competition among sellers, which makes the market a lot more unpredictable.
So anyone out there looking to buy a house right now, the best advice is to stay informed, work closely with a good real estate agent, and be prepared for things to change quickly.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that all those geopolitical events we've been talking about, the war in Ukraine, the tensions between the U.S. and China, potential tariffs, all of that can have a real impact on the economy in ways we might not expect.
True. It's easy to forget that the global landscape and our own local realities are always connected in some way. But before we get too deep into those connections, let's take a moment to think about this. How do you think President Trump's comments about recouping aid costs from Europe might affect transatlantic relations, especially now when there's this growing need for a united front against China? It's a question worth pondering. We'll be back after a short break to explore that and more.
Yeah, it's a tough situation for sure. You've got President Trump pushing for what he sees as, basic fairness when it comes to who's paying for what. But if the U.S. pushes too hard on this, it could really damage those relationships with key European allies. And that's not good, especially now when we need everyone on the same page to deal with China.
Exactly. It's all about finding that sweet spot. Balancing the financial stuff with the need to keep those alliances strong. And that's where President Macron's take on things gets really interesting. He agrees that there needs to be more shared responsibility, but he frames it more as like a team effort, emphasizing collaboration instead of making it sound like a debt collection thing. Yeah, it's subtle, but it makes a difference. It really reflects Macron's diplomatic style and how much he wants to keep those strong relationships with both the U.S. and the rest of Europe.
For sure. And remember that U.S.-Ukraine agreement on critical minerals we talked about before? Well, that adds another layer of intrigue to this whole geopolitical puzzle.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Could this be a strategic play by the U.S. to secure those essential minerals from somewhere else? Maybe try to reduce their dependence on China?
It's definitely a possibility, and if that's the case, it raises another question. How will China react to this kind of shift in the global supply chain, especially with all the tension over Taiwan already?
It's starting to feel like one of those high-stakes poker games where everyone's trying to figure out each other's next move.
That's a great way to put it. And in a game like this, knowing what motivates each player and how they might react is absolutely crucial.
Okay, so let's try to get inside China's head for a minute. We know they're not exactly happy about the West supporting Ukraine. Could this whole situation push them closer to Russia? Create an even stronger alliance against the West?
It's possible, but we have to remember that China always plays the long game. They're driven by their own strategic interests. So while they might agree with Russia on some things, like pushing back against Western dominance, China's also not going to get too caught up in Russia's mess, especially if it starts hurting them economically.
So it's not as simple as just picking sides. There's a lot more nuance to it than that. But, okay, let's say China doesn't fully align with Russia. How else might they react to the U.S. getting more involved in Ukraine and this potential shift in the critical mineral supply chain?
Well, they could decide to get more assertive in other areas,
Yeah.
like the South China Sea or when it comes to Taiwan. We already know that Taiwan is a major flashpoint. So if China feels like their interests there are being threatened, they could definitely get more aggressive.
That's a scary thought. It feels like the stakes keep getting higher. But, we've been talking a lot about all these global power struggles. But what does it actually mean for, the average person listening to this? Why should they care about these geopolitical chess moves?
Because we live in a globalized world. What happens over there affects what happens over here. These events can have a real impact on everything, from the prices you see at the grocery store to the overall stability of the world.
Yeah, that's true. It's easy to feel disconnected from these global events, but the reality is they can affect our everyday lives in very real ways.
Absolutely. For example, if China decides to react aggressively to what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine, it could mess up those global supply chains. That means shortages, delays, higher prices for all sorts of things. And that affects businesses, jobs, people's wallets.
Okay, now it's starting to hit home. So knowing all this, what can we as individuals do about it? It all feels kind of overwhelming.
I get that. The first step is just being aware of these connections. Don't just read the headlines. Look deeper. Ask yourself, why is this happening? What could happen next?
Stay informed. Think critically. Don't just believe everything you hear. Solid advice.
It really is. And don't underestimate what informed citizens can do. When people understand what's at stake, they can demand better from their leaders. They can advocate for responsible action and make smarter choices in their own lives.
I like that. It's empowering.
Yeah.
We might not be world leaders, but we can still make a difference. Okay, so we talked about China potentially stepping in as a peacemaker,
Yeah.
President Trump pushing Europe to pay more for Ukraine, that whole U.S.-Ukraine critical minerals deal, and how all of this could affect the global economy and consumer behavior. What else should we be watching out for as this whole situation keeps developing?
Well, one thing to keep an eye on is that meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky. Whatever happens in those discussions could really shape the future of U.S.-Ukraine relations and impact the whole region.
Especially with that critical minerals agreement still up in the air. That's got to be at the top of the agenda, right?
Yeah, most likely. And don't forget what the senior colonel said about China and Taiwan. That's another situation we need to watch closely. Any escalation there could have some serious global consequences.
It's like a giant house of cards.
Yeah,
And every card is a potential crisis waiting to happen.
perfect analogy. And speaking of delicate situations, we also need to think about how President Trump's push for Europe to take on more of the financial burden for Ukraine's security will play out. If the U.S. pushes too hard, it could cause a rift in that Western alliance, and that could make it harder to present a united front against China's growing influence.
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act. Trying to manage those financial concerns while keeping those alliances strong, it really shows how important diplomacy and cooperation are on the global stage.
For sure. And it just reinforces how important it is to understand all these connections. Something that seems like a purely domestic economic policy, like trying to recoup aid costs, well, that can actually have huge effects on international relations and global power dynamics.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we're all part of this interconnected system. And what we do, even if it seems small, can have the big impact somewhere else.
Exactly. And that brings us back to our listeners. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this global stuff, but when you understand those connections and the potential consequences, it actually gives you more power to make informed decisions in your own life.
That's a really important point. Whether it's making financial decisions, understanding global trends, or even just having more informed conversations, this kind of knowledge helps you navigate all the complexities of our interconnected world.
Absolutely. It's all about recognizing that the world doesn't work in isolation.
Wow.
Geopolitics, economics, consumer behavior, it's all connected.
And seeing those connections is the key to understanding the bigger picture.
Mm.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the most important things our listeners should take away from all of this?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is this. Knowledge is power. The more you know about how the world works, the better prepared you'll be to deal with the challenges and take advantage of the opportunities that come your way.
That's a great way to put it. Stay informed, stay curious, keep asking questions. Because in a world where everything is connected, understanding those connections is crucial for making sense of it all.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And with that, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope our listeners have found it insightful.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep connecting those dots.
Yeah, it really is a lot to think about. But okay, even with all that said, what else should we be watching for? As this whole situation keeps unfolding, what are some other key developments that could shake things up?
Well, one big one is that meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky. What comes out of those talks could have a huge impact, not just on U.S.-Ukraine relations, but on the whole dynamic in the region.
Yeah, especially with that critical minerals deal still hanging in the balance. I'm sure that'll be a major point of discussion, definitely. And then there's that whole thing with China and Taiwan. The senior colonel mentioned how China might be getting impatient. Well, any kind of escalation there could have serious ripple effects across the globe.
It's like we're standing on a fault line, just waiting for the next tremor.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And while we're talking about delicate situations, we can't forget about President Trump's push for Europe to foot more of the bill for Ukraine's security. If the U.S. pushes too hard, it could really strain those relationships within the Western alliance. And that's not what we need right now when we're trying to present a united front against China.
It's a tough balancing act, for
Yeah.
sure. Trying to juggle those financial considerations while also maintaining those crucial alliances. It really underscores how important diplomacy and cooperation are in today's world.
Absolutely. And it all comes back to understanding this complex interconnections. Something that might seem like a purely domestic economic policy, like trying to recoup aid costs. Well, that can actually have a huge impact on international relations and global power dynamics.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we're all part of this global system.
Yeah.
What we do, even seemingly small things, can have a ripple effect somewhere else.
Exactly. And that brings us back to our listeners. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer scale and complexity of all these global events.
Hmm.
But when you start to understand those connections and the potential consequences, it can actually be empowering. It helps you make more informed decisions in your own life.
It's true. Whether it's making financial decisions, understanding global trends, or even just having more informed conversations, this kind of knowledge helps us navigate the complexities of our interconnected world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that nothing happens in isolation. Geopolitics, economics, consumer behavior, it's all intertwined.
And seeing those connections is really the key to understanding the bigger picture. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind? What's the big picture message here?
I think the most important takeaway is this: knowledge is power. The more you understand about how the world works, the better equipped you'll be to face the challenges and seize the opportunities that come your way.
That's a great point. Stay informed, stay curious, and most importantly, never stop asking questions. Because in a world where everything is connected, understanding those connections is essential for making sense of it all.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you found it insightful.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration. We'll be back soon with another deep dive to a new topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep connecting those dots.